Okay, we're live now.
Okay, awesome. Senate Gov Ops back on the 16th, the snowy 16th of January. And let's see, we have Ashlyn from the secretary or the treasurer's office. Hey, Ashlyn, is Jeremiah coming too? Or are you going to testify, or what's the deal?
Jeremiah is coming. He just texted me and said he'll be right on.
Okay.
And I think that he is has more expertise in the particular questions I anticipate you'll have for him.
Okay.
So it might be best
problem.
to wait. Thank
Okay,
you.
we're going to start with one of our other witnesses and then come back to him. So, okay, excellent. So we have Stephanie Smith from the State Hazard Mitigation Office. She is the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for the Vermont Emergency Management. Stephanie, there you are again. Yay. We'll start by introducing ourselves, and then I'll sort of set the stage for why we've called everybody here, and then you can tell us what you think we should know. But I'm Senator Ruth Hardy. I'm the chair of the committee, and I represent the Addison district.
Olivia Parker, committee assistant.
Senator Tony Gutowski, I'm vice chair of the committee, and I represent the Chittenden Central District.
And this empty chair is Senator Becca White. She represents the Windsor district, and she is en route, stuck in a snowstorm somewhere en route to Vermont.
That's sort of the case.
Go ahead.
Senator Bob Norris, Franklin County, to include Elbert and Grandel County.
Ann Watson, Washington district.
Allison Clarkson, Windsor County District.
Excellent. So that's who we are, because I'm not sure if we had you in last session. I don't think we did. But we have been taking a lot of testimony on the flood recovery and community resilience and flood mitigation from the perspective of our committee's jurisdiction, which is government operations, and how can we do better next time? Because I think almost everybody agrees that there will probably be a next time. And what can we learn from what we did well and what we maybe didn't do so well this past time? And how can we also make our government itself more resilient, because the government was also the victim of flooding. So just sort of those are the conversations we're having. Today we tried to invite some people in who are have expertise in the sort of funding and that kind of area, some of the flood relief funds. We do have a bill on our wall, S-179, that's related to issuing flood bonds. But mostly we would like to hear from your perspective what we should know, and if there are things that you would recommend that we would include. We're going to do a committee bill of sort of flood government response, more than flood, just disaster government response. So that's what we're thinking, and that this goes for you, Stephanie, but any of the other witnesses who are listening too, so I don't have to repeat this 20 times. But so that's my spiel, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I do have a couple of slides, but it looks like I can't share my screen. So I'm happy to just talk if that's easier, but.
I think Olivia just gave you permission, so.
Okay. There we go. Thank you very much. Okay.
And then we'll post this on there.
Yeah, I don't, Olivia, I don't think I sent it to you, so I can do that after this as well. So
that would be great.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management. So I manage our hazard mitigation program with the goal of making Vermont safer and more resilient in the face of climate change and natural hazards. So the total program, and I'll focus in a minute, but the whole program includes planning and grants. So just a quick note about our state hazard mitigation plan, which is a document that we update every 5 years. We just received FEMA approval for the most recent version, our 2023 version, back in November. So the state hazard mitigation plan is a document that assesses all of the natural hazards that Vermont is vulnerable to and proposes a mitigation strategy to improve our resilience and reduce future risk. And it's a very stakeholder-based process. So bringing the right people together to have the right conversations to help move things forward is really the intent through that document. And on the funding side, I share this just to give you the breadth of most of the programs that fall within my purview. I manage several FEMA-funded grant programs, and then also a state grant program, which is the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. So I'll focus most of this on our state program today, because that was the prompt for me. So I'll talk mostly about the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, but if there are questions about any of these other FEMA grant programs, I'd be happy to speak to those as well.
Great.
So focusing in here, so the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, the purpose of the program is around reducing flood risk and creating an accessible program for our small communities that fills some of the gaps in what we see available within the FEMA funding that I manage. So in FY22, we received an initial allocation from the legislature to create the program. We worked very closely with the Department of Environmental Conservation through that process. Very quickly obligated the first $5 million in the fall of 22, and then received an additional allocation the next year for $15 million. We also received a general fund allocation in FY23, which would allow us to match FEMA funding since we were unable to use the ARPA funding towards FEMA match for FEMA projects. So we have an additional $8 million that was allocated there. And because the program is funded through ARPA, one of the requirements or how it was eligible through ARPA was through meeting the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund criteria for all of our projects. So it required that we have a water quality tie to all of the flood reduction, but really the focus being on how do we reduce our flood risk through the program. And just quick on eligibility. So eligible projects under the program included buyouts as the top priority, really the impetus behind the program. Those that are ineligible for FEMA funding, which includes vacant parcels that have the potential to be developed. Natural resource projects are also eligible. Generally, that's floodplain restoration projects where we're removing fill, we're slowing the river down, giving it space during flooding events. And we also allowed for project scoping to develop projects and planning activities. As of December 2023, all of our available ARPA funding has been obligated to specific projects. We set aside a small amount of money, about $600,000, in the event that we have projects come in a little bit higher than anticipated. Specifically with the property buyouts, given the housing market, we are seeing appraisals come back high. So we wanted to make sure we saved a little bit of funding for that. But outside of that small amount, the rest of the funding has been obligated. This is just a visual to give you a sense of where across the state, the breadth of the program and where we've obligated our dollars. And just a quick by the numbers of what we obligated funding to. So the main purpose of the program, again, from the beginning was having a way to do buyouts, property buyouts that are not eligible for FEMA funding. So that has been the focus of the program with 35 individual properties and about $13 million out of the $20 million total going towards property buyouts. We've also obligated 12 floodplain restoration projects, which, like the buyouts, are opportunities to, again, open up that flood space, slow the river down during a flooding event. And a few of these projects were paired with buyouts. So we did some vacant parcel purchases where we then also will be doing restoration on those same sites, lowering flood elevations in the surrounding neighborhoods.
I have a quick question.
All right, so I'm just gonna stop you. Senator Norris has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Stephanie, when you say 35 individual property buyouts, at what level is that? Is it 100% or is it 80%? What is that?
Yeah, so for the most part on the property buyouts, we're covering 100% of the cost. So on the FEMA side, we're covering 75% through FEMA funding, and then using our general fund allocation to cover the match, because it's never, even before the housing market was as crazy as it is, it doesn't make sense to do buyouts when we can't make people whole. So we're trying to do as much as we can to make sure that we're giving people the full value of their property.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the last couple of notes here, there's one large community flood reduction project that we funded in Whitingham, and a couple of scoping assessments. And the hope with the scoping assessments is that we're able to use those projects to develop projects that will then be submitted under our FEMA funding that we have following July. So hopefully that's getting us to projects that we can then submit for FEMA funding. And I want to take just a 2-minute, I'll say maybe 3-minute tangent here to talk about why this program is important, why it was created in the first place. And so one of the biggest challenges that we have in funding projects with FEMA dollars is that flooding in Vermont looks a lot different than it does in most of the country. So FEMA is very focused on inundation flooding, which is water that comes up and spills out onto a floodplain, which is the picture on the left here. While the most significant flood risk we see in Vermont is actually erosion-based, which is caused by water that's moving quickly down mountains, cutting around corners, and eroding away banks, which is more what this picture on the right is illustrating. So the special flood hazard area, if you've heard that term, is the FEMA map that illustrates that inundation risk area. It's the map that's used for flood insurance purposes, for determining whether you have to have flood insurance or not. While the river corridor is mapped by the Agency of Natural Resources, and it shows the meander belts of the river. So the intent is showing where the river wants to move over time, and it's a much better indicator of where we might see erosion risk, because naturally rivers wouldn't stay in one place, they would migrate. And what we saw following Irene were a lot of houses that looked like this, where they might have been high next to the river, but the bank was eroded underneath. And with a one-time failure and a property that's outside of the special flood hazard area, we were not able to do FEMA buyouts on this type of property. So that was really the impetus behind the program, learning through Tropical Storm Irene what our biggest risks were and getting to projects through that. And
Great.
yeah,
Stephanie, I'm going to stop you because Senator Vihoski has a question.
Yeah, so I understand that special flood hazard designation is set by FEMA. How frequently is that updated?
Yeah, so not terribly frequently. So I would encourage you to talk to the Rivers team at the Department of Environmental Conservation for more detail on those maps and what they do and don't do. Some of the maps across the state are still from the 1970s, and the data was quite poor. So most of the state FEMA's in process of updating those maps, but it's going to be a few years before we really see those. But if you're looking for more detail on that, I would push you to Rob Evans from the Department of Environmental Conservation. He manages the Rivers program and could speak to it much more eloquently than I can.
Yeah, and he's overseeing the whole River Corridors project.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. We'll talk about we have Senator Watson in the room, who's on our Natural Resources Committee, who's I think heard from Rob and others. So thank you for that. We'll have him in and have a broader conversation about this.
Can I just add?
Yeah, Senator Clarkson.
Just to touch on this, as we begin to look at regional and county government, Stephanie, which we'll touch on as we look at how to improve to respond to things. Rob is so important because he oversees and has mapped out all the river corridors. So that will be, obviously we'll be doing that kind of mitigation planning river corridor by river corridor, which is a regional discussion, just to tie this into our future work.
Yeah, well, and I think also Senator Watson's morning committee is working on this kind of thing as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Stephanie, sorry, carry on.
Nope, no worries at all. I have one more slide here where I'll stay on this one for a little bit just to talk about what this program has been doing since July. So the challenges that I just shared with you are still challenges that we're seeing in the state. And directly following the July flood, we set up an intake form for property owners that might be interested in buyouts. We have just over 300 responses on that form right now. And that's not people who are fully committed, but they're interested. They want to know more and they're considering potentially doing a property buyout. So my team and I have been meeting with the communities over the last several months to have initial conversations regarding the process and to start developing applications. The first thing we're able to do once someone fills out this intake form is figure out whether the project would be FEMA eligible or not. So that was one of the reasons we set this up in the first place, was to help us get just enough information to make that decision and know where to push people in terms of getting their applications developed and starting to have those conversations with towns. We can do day before the storm property values, just another note that I'll make. So for those who were impacted in July, we're purchasing those properties at the day before the storm value. So what the value would have been like on July 9th. And under FRCF, the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, we just approved buyouts that were impacted following July in the towns that are listed up here. So Hardwick, Marshfield, Middlebury, Wolcott, Cambridge, Plymouth, Morristown, and one in Montpelier. This was how we spent the final $5 million worth of ARPA funding that we had available. So it's 16 individual properties across those communities. And we currently have applications under development for about $4.5 million worth of property buyouts that were impacted following July. So these are applications that we'd started developing prior to that December round when we obligated the rest of the funding. We are still keeping a list of those so that we know if additional funding does become available, that we have those applications ready to go so we can move forward. And just to give you one last piece of context here, so from that 300 or so properties that filled out the intake form, and again, I don't think we'll buy all of those, but from those 300 properties, we have about $20 million worth of properties that will not qualify on the FEMA side. So we're looking at that as the potential gap in available funding currently. We'll see some attrition in that list, but I think we'll also see once we start working with communities that there is more interest once they start to see buyouts going forward. So I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So the 20 million, did you say 20 million basically is the value of the properties that are in the queue for potential buyout?
Yes, that are not FEMA eligible. So the rest we think we can get to be FEMA eligible.
I see. And I saw your list. You did not mention Ripton. Is there a house in Ripton, perhaps, maybe?
Yes, so the landslide property, I can stop sharing so you can see me better. The landslide property in Ripton is eligible on the FEMA side. So landslides, if they're at imminent risk of failure, that's normally the way that we do landslide buyouts is before they fail. And that requires a determination from the state geologist. Then we can submit them for FEMA funding. So the one in Ripton has already been submitted to FEMA for review. And then we have a couple of two properties in Hardwick that have already gone to FEMA for review as well. And I have about just under $5 million worth of projects that are buyouts within the final stages of signature. So we have another $5 million that's about to go to FEMA in a few different towns.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes. I had heard that it wasn't FEMA eligible, so thank you for that update.
May I just tag onto that?
Yep.
So that's also true for the Ludlow properties, the buyout request in Ludlow and in Weston.
So Weston
eligible.
Yeah, so Weston I think will be. Ludlow. If you're talking about an older property, there's one that was awarded under a prior round that we're getting close to closing on.
Well, the Irene one, the
yes,
whole one from Irene, the timbered, but
yes, so that is a FEMA. Yes, that one's on the FEMA side.
But there are a couple others that were new impacts along the river. Anyway, we can chat about that at another point.
Senator Vygotsky has a question.
Yeah, I did, and so I had a couple of questions. One is sort of once you buy out a property, what happens to the property? What do you do with it?
Yes, so generally, so on the FEMA side, the town is required to be the sub-applicant for the project, and then they're required to own the space in perpetuity, maintain it as open space.
Okay.
So on the Flood Resilient Communities Fund side, we can be a little more creative. So sometimes a nonprofit ends up owning, if it's like a conservation entity that wants to own the parcel, we can do that. But on the FEMA side, it generally has to be the municipality, and then nothing is allowed to be developed.
Okay, and then my other question around funding is, and maybe you don't know, or maybe you do know, but I know some other federal funds like the infrastructure funds and the Inflation Reduction Act funds were meant to go towards sort of resiliency and climate stuff as well. Are you eligible for any of those federal funds?
Yeah, so none of the only piece that comes through with FEMA is additional funding for their annual Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Fund program. That's the only one that I'm aware of. So there are some other programs that might do similar work, but they're through the EPA or through a different federal entity.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about how if there are federal funds available, we can direct them into the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Watson?
Yes, so I've got a couple questions. One, at the very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there's a document about that's like a list of climate change hazards. What was the name of that document?
Yes, that's the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. So we have to, it's required in order for us to access any FEMA hazard mitigation funding or public assistance funding as well. And so we're required to update it, meeting FEMA's list of requirements every 5 years. So we have a version from 2023. We just got it approved in November, and it addresses all the natural hazards that Vermont is vulnerable to. So the top two are erosion, flooding, and then inundation flooding.
And so, sorry, so was that, so it's not specific to climate change, it's just natural hazards in general?
Yes, but climate change is very much a focus within it. It's how are we seeing these hazards change? So there's a big focus on heat in this plan, more so than the prior plan, because we were more concerned about that than we used to be. And so things like that, and trying to make those ties between hazards. So connections like when we have invasive species like Japanese knotweed along our rivers, it actually increases our erosion risk. So it's not just looking at each individual bucket, but trying to draw those connections and look at what this means for us longer term through the lens of climate change.
Okay, and then thank you. And then my second question, you mentioned the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. I guess one of the things that's on my radar through this discussion generally is, some of our state funds that we set up have been very helpful in terms of the funding that still remains in these. I'm sort of assuming that a lot of the funds have been spent down, and so ideally, if we had a lot of resources, like we would be recapitalizing some of these funds, which leaves the question of like which funds should be recapitalized and to what degree. And so do you have any recommendations about that?
Yeah, my very biased opinion is that this program is incredibly important, and I would love to find a way to continue supporting it. We have obligated funding, so we do not currently have available funding under this program.
Okay, so it would be funding for the state hazard mitigation fund, is that what it?
The Flood Resilient Communities.
The Flood Resilient Communities Fund, trying to get the names right.
Yes, so the ARPA program was the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. Because of the ARPA requirements, it was required to only be flooding focused. That wouldn't necessarily have to be the case if we had other funding. It's FEMA funding, we can do other things. So I think it could be that program, it could be the next iteration of it, and whatever that looks like.
Got it. Senator Clarkson.
So that, Stephanie, of course, goes to my question, which is, when we re-up this fund, I would very much hope it wasn't just flooding, but was just disaster resilient or communities fund or whatever, because we're going to see disasters that are very different from flooding.
Yes.
So broadly speaking, besides putting more money in that fund if we're able to, are there other things that, as we look at government operations in the face of climate change and disaster, that we should be doing that you would recommend? It can be really small tweak that you realized, oh, we should change that, or something bigger. We're open to any suggestions at this point.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I would just say that there's a lot that's already going on, and I think what I see as most helpful is figuring out how we can better support the things that already exist and the connections we've been making. So, for example, we work very closely with the Climate Action Office, which is still a fairly new entity. They've only been around about a year, but trying to figure out how all of this work connects across state government and within existing programs. So I think that's a place to start anyway, from my perspective.
Okay, that's great. All right, well, Stephanie, thank you so much. I think we have exhausted our questions for now, and really appreciate all of the work that you have done for all of our communities during this. So thank you so much for helping so many of our constituents find a path forward after the flooding.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Feel better. Bye-bye. Okay, next up, I see Jeremiah has joined us. Hey, Jeremiah.
There.
Were you here for our introductions and my spiel about why we've called you here?
I was indeed, yes.
Okay, good. So I won't repeat it then. But if you could introduce yourself, and then specifically, we do have a bill on our wall, S-179, that is directly related to the Treasurer's Office. So if you have thoughts on that bill, also let us know.
Yes, I am prepared to speak on that. So I am Jeremiah Breer. I am the Chief Financial Officer of the State Treasurer's Office. I've been with that position since July of 2022. It is nice to be with you all this afternoon. So so concerning, I guess I will start with the bill. So concerning the bill, which authorizes the treasurer to issue bonds for financing flood recovery and mitigation and disaster preparedness measures. So as you know, the typical process for issuing bonds is that the CDAC committee will make a recommendation to the legislature concerning the total amount of debt to be issued over the biennium. And then the legislature, after they receive that recommendation, they will formulate the capital bill, and then the capital bill will authorize the total amount of debt to be issued. And so under this process and under some sort of standing, statutes that give the treasurer authority to issue debt, we see that the authority that is given in the bill is perhaps not necessary, and that the treasurer can really bond for really any purpose. And so if there were disaster recovery or flood mitigation items in the capital bill, the treasurer would be able to bond for those under the existing authority. And so there's some advantages in going that route. And one is that it has been the legislature's practice to adopt the recommendation from the CDAC committee. So the CDAC committee will give a total amount to the legislature. And one advantage of that is that the CDAC is formulating that recommendation after analyzing the state's financial condition, after looking at debt levels over time, historical debt levels, and after comparing our debt levels to metrics that are important to the rating agencies, like debt as a percentage of personal income, debt per capita, and such. And so historically, the state's debt actually grew pretty significantly in the wake of the Great Recession. So if you look at sort of like 2009 and the couple years after that, you see our amount of debt issued per year climbing pretty significantly, and then likewise the total amount of debt outstanding. And then you see kind of around 2014, 2015. Sort of this concerted effort to sort of rein that back in, and the recommendations from the committee, which then of course were adopted by the legislature, fell, and then likewise, so that the state's total debt outstanding fell, to our current sort of level where we're looking at about 108 million, recommendation for the current biennium. And so those lower bonding amounts have kind of come together with some other factors which have really put the state in a very strong financial position. So also kind of along that period, the state has been funding its statutory reserves at 5% of appropriations, which is a very healthy fiscal practice. Something that the rating agencies very much favorably look upon, and especially in the last few years. So since the pandemic, the state's cash on hand has really grown substantially. So if you go back to look at 2019, 2018, state's daily cash 500, 600 million, and we're now more in the kind of the $2 billion range. And much of that cash is federal fund related, and will be spent over the next few years. But there's quite a bit of cash there that is just sort of organic growth, and is due to sort of sound fiscal management practices on the side of the state. And so I say all that to say that has really put us in a very strong financial position, and has allowed us to really quickly and effectively our office to assist in some of the flood recovery efforts from in July. And so one item that we were able to do is that we worked with the tax department, and we identified about $10 million in tax payments for Hold Harmless and the pilot program that were due to municipalities to go out in October. And we sent those payments in advance. So we sent them out around the 25th of July. And so, as the towns were going to receive those funds anyway, but as a lot of the needs were really, really acute and really immediate. And so what this did is it put cash in their hands to start, getting work right away, and kind of give them some time to figure out, what the next steps are. And then the second piece, and I think you were interested in this, is that we used $15 million of the Treasurer's Credit Facility, also known as the 10% in Vermont program, to lend to this municipal climate recovery fund through the Vermont Bond Bank. And so that is a low interest loan program, estimated to save municipalities about $3.5 million in interest. And with that program, we do expect that most of the municipalities that are receiving loans underneath that program will get federal funding. So they're using this for projects that will likely be at least mostly reimbursed from FEMA in the long run. But as you know, it can take some time to get the funds from FEMA. And so this again gives them that liquidity to get working and addressing those needs right away. And it also is giving them a much lower rate than they would be able to get at a bank. And so that would be the alternative for most of these towns, is you either get a private loan while they're waiting for FEMA funding at a much higher interest rate, or potentially just delay the projects. And so again, that us having the capacity to do this program is also really enabled by the prudent debt management and financial management practices of the state. And so we were able to do both of these things, the 10 million in advance payments and the 15 million from the credit facility, without in any way endangering the state's cash flows or credit rating. I mean, there was plenty of resources for that, really due to the fact that we have been really diligent about managing those other pieces, managing the cash reserves and managing the debt and the bonding capacity. So that is what I have for you today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeremiah. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
One, do you have a chart that you could send us that shows that the debt load of the state? You were describing how it went up during the recession, and then in the years since it's gone down. If you have a visual that would help us see that better, that would be great.
Yes, I certainly do. Yeah, in the most recent CDAC report, happy to send that off to you. But yes, there's actually a graphic that very much shows that.
Okay, that's what I figured that was something you might have. That would be helpful. And I just want to make sure I understand your position or the information you shared about S-179, which is that you feel like the treasurer already has this authority, and it doesn't need to be explicitly granted to the treasurer to allow them to issue bonds for flood relief. And do you think that's true for any kind of disaster mitigation, or is it specific to floods?
So any capital project. So if there were any spending the treasurer can bond for. So I would say it is any disaster. And then, the typical process is that the state generally only bonds for capital projects. And so if there's any sort of infrastructure project or capital project that was related to a disaster or a flood in any way, that could be put into the capital bill. And so I think the simple answer is yes, there really is not a restriction on what the treasurer can bond for.
Okay. And does that, do you see any benefit to having the explicit authority granted, or encouragement or anything like that? Or is it really just not necessary?
Frankly, I don't think that it is necessary.
Okay, perfect. And also we have gotten some testimony from towns about the need for certain specialized expensive equipment. And I'm wondering, what are the rules around bonding for equipment?
This is flood recovery.
Yeah, it's flood recovery. It's specialized vectors and grabbers and lots of things that are too expensive for towns, and they probably won't need them very often, but would love to have more on hand to borrow from the state.
Instead of having to rent them at great expense.
Yeah, so is that something you can bond for?
You mean if the state, I believe if the state were to own the equipment, then yes, we currently would have the authority to bond for that.
Okay. but you couldn't bond for something that was owned by a group of municipalities, for example. The state could not bond for that.
That is an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure. I suppose theoretically the state could bond and then sort of like, grant those to the towns. I'd have to get back to you on the mechanics of that. I believe the answer is yes, we could do that, but I'm not sure. I have not encountered that particular scenario.
I'm not
Madam Chair,
necessarily
if I might
suggesting
also offer an additional piece of information on the municipal equipment
Okay, hold on
question.
just a second, Ashley. If Ashlyn, if you could just introduce yourself. We can't see you because Jeremiah is taking up the full screen. So okay.
Sure. For the record, my name is Ashlyn Doyon, and I'm the Director of Policy in the State Treasurer's Office. The State Treasurer also administers what is called the Municipal Equipment Loan Fund, which is a fund that municipalities have historically been able to go to for low interest loans for things like fire trucks, ambulances, I think even the occasional school bus. I don't see why flood related specialized equipment would not be included in this. And my understanding is that this program is not meant to fully subsidize those costs. However, we can do loans for up to 75% of the project cost or $110,000. We are recommending in BAA language this year to increase that maximum amount to $150,000. We're not seeking an additional appropriation for this fund this year. It's relatively healthy at about $1.5 million. And more information on the Municipal Equipment Loan Fund can be found on our website. We've also, just to note, had instances in the past where more than one municipality is sharing a piece of equipment. So if you're hearing from your towns in the districts that you represent that this is a need and you think that the Treasurer's Office may be able to assist with that, please put them in touch with us.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashlyn. That's really helpful. I think what we've heard mostly is that there are towns that need to borrow this really expensive equipment and it might be good for the state to own it. But I was also thinking if, for example, we had county government that could purchase things, how could they use the state funding? But this is exactly the fund. Could you send us just send the link to Olivia?
Yes, definitely.
Just so we have that information we can share on our web page as well. All right, I think those are my questions at the moment. Do any of you guys have questions for the Treasurer's Office? Okay, and I guess I'll ask you the same question I asked before, which is, do you have any recommendations, whether they're small or large, that we should include in our bigger kind of committee bill about government response to flooding or to disaster mitigation or resilience? Small tweaks or big things.
I don't have any recommendations.
Okay.
I don't know that I have any specific recommendations other than just to say that the state's strong financial position in the wake of the disaster in July was a result of decades of fiscal prudence, and we were able to respond in ways such as with those advanced payments and with the $15 million credit facility because of all of that work that we'd done in the past and sort of maintaining high standards for ourselves in terms of our financial management. And so when we're thinking about things like flood recovery bonds and, the magnitude at which we might do something like that, I do think it ties back to that CDAC debt affordability limit and just a general balance of making strategic investments in this area while also maintaining a strong financial portfolio overall. And so I'll just offer that as the committee continues to work on this topic, please keep our office informed if there's any way that we can be helpful as you're trying to balance those two goals. We'd love to plug in and be a partner. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. And if you think of anything that we maybe are missing, please let us know and we'll have you back if we need to pick your brains again. Thank you both so much.
Thank
And
you.
Stay warm out there in the snow. And I think do we have Elizabeth Gilman? Okay. Elizabeth, are you there? Hey, how are you? Oh, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Were you on? I think you were, for our introduction and my overview of why, and specifically for you, we were interested, correct me if I'm wrong, but you oversee the 211 program, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so for specifically for you, we know that the 211 program was a huge part of our infrastructure, our technical infrastructure and flood recovery and response, immediate response. And so we want to hear from you, your perspective, how things went and what we can do better next time. And then we probably have some things to share with you about what we're hearing as well, and sort of have a conversation about it. So if you want to just take it away, but just know that we are really interested in hearing more about 211.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. So I think I'd like to start off with maybe some of the things that were different this time and what we experienced. So the July flooding was the first time that Vermont 211 took business damage reports. Typically, we've only ever collected for residential. This was the first time that Vermont 211 had their damage reports online, which I think was a great tool, and allowed us to collect just shy of 6,000 damage reports. Over 1,000 of those were businesses. So that was very helpful. We also noticed that there was maybe some misunderstandings or misconceptions about 211's role during the time of disaster. So Vermont 211 does not provide volunteers for cleanup. We also do not vet volunteers for cleanup. That's not our role. We look to other entities to do that hands-on work, whether that is Serve Vermont or local community groups within long-term recovery groups, or VOAD, or in the case of this flood, for the first time, crisis cleanup. So that was another first. We had not referred to them. That was a decision that we were told about and quickly put into the database and started referring to assist with the cleanup from the flooding. Also, because this was the first time that we had online data forms. In the past, we have always shared data collected from those damage reports with emergency management and AHS emergency management. And this time around, that data, they were really wanting to pull that data to share directly with municipalities and towns, and also share with crisis cleanup. So that was new for us, and I think new for emergency management, although I don't want to speak for them. So there was this idea that somehow Vermont 211 were the folks that were sharing that with towns and municipalities. That was not us. That's not our role. That is not what we do. There were concerns about privacy, and I heard a lot of feedback about people saying that their medical information was shared, and a lot of other personal information that actually was never even on the form. So we do not share medical information. We don't collect medical information from people. We don't ask about disabilities. We don't ask those questions. So I think there was a lot that really gained a lot of ground. There was a belief that that was happening. And there also, on those forms, there's a clear statement that your information, if you complete a form, will be shared with municipalities and towns so that they can assist you And I think that that was also overlooked. So there were a lot of changes. There were a lot of new things this time around. Clearly the volume was above and beyond. And I think from that, there were a lot of good tools that have kind of developed. So having this available online was super helpful. And then we were able to do it again in the December flooding, although clearly much less to a degree than in July. But being able to direct people to the website first really enabled us to assist callers who experienced flooding and had other issues like imminent need for housing, imminent need for food, those sorts of things. So I think it was a great step toward being able to collect information quickly and being able to share it easily. I will say by the end of collecting data for flooding, what had started out as being a few entities that was receiving that information had grown dramatically to include Red Cross and Serve Vermont and FEMA and all these other folks. I don't know if that's good or bad, to be honest with you, but that is how it ended at, you know, by the time we had stopped taking damage reports. So I think that while we have a lot of really good tools here, like in any disaster, you can't be 100% prepared all the time. So you have to be as prepared as you can be, and you have to be able to pivot quickly. And I think some of the data and reporting and communication things that we started putting in place this time around are good foundations to make better and improve before the next time we have a disaster or another event like this. You know, in terms of sort of the data, suggestions would be, I think we need to maybe be very clear and have agreed upon and concise standard of how information is shared and whom it's shared with and what information exactly is shared and how does that get out to municipalities and towns that need it. And maybe that involves a quote clean version of data that maybe strips some information that's necessary maybe for AHS, but it may not be necessary for everyone. You know, I think that we just need to have some kind of standard and agreed upon standard around what that looks like and how we share it. That would be my recommendation, but I think that this did build that opportunity to kind of have these things in place and be able to take a look at it. I don't think Vermont 211 has collected this level of information since Irene. That's my understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, you collected a ton of information, so I definitely appreciate the need for sort of cleaning up what are the standards for information sharing, information collection and storage. How long do you keep the data that you collected?
And how is it accessible?
And how is it accessible to others? So right now, what are you doing with it?
So we have the data because believe it or not, we still are getting damage reports.
Yeah.
Why? So, you know, we still have the data, and then every time we get that, we do have a staff person who does sit at the SCOC when it's active and is the contact for the data for Vermont Emergency Management. So she is still sending those reports out to the appropriate folks. But at the end of the day, what do we do with the data? It is used purely to share with emergency management so that they can do what they need to do with it, whether it's, you know, notify AHS emergency management if there's housing issues. You know, we don't use that data. We don't contact folks on that list. So the data is intended, we collect it. We're that main statewide place where we can get the information from Vermonters and be able to pass it along to the appropriate agency. The only thing that we report on for ourselves when we do impact reports and things like that is numbers. So we don't actually look at individuals or any of that information. It's more about county and numbers.
Got it. And so to the extent that the data was shared with volunteer organizations, that was done by Vermont Emergency Management, not by 211. Is that correct? Okay. Well, I will ask them those questions then. We'll have to figure out who is the person at Vermont Emergency Management that it would have overseen the 211 data once it got there. Do you know?
I don't know, but I'm sure Eric Horrend knows.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure he does. Yes, I would know he does.
Yeah.
So on another issue that was sort of in the ether about 211 was staffing and budgetary support and your ability to do all the things that we asked you to do with the resources that you have. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we've made, as all of you know, we've made some improvements in being able to gain more sustainable funding in this past year. This was an interesting situation. So we've been level funded for 6 years just prior to the flood. Our hours were cut on July 1st and the flooding took place on July 9th. We had not received any additional funding prior to the flood. So Vermont 211 was not in a position where we were able to maintain a volunteer coordinator. We were not in a position where we had a disaster of that magnitude in a while. The previous ED is no longer in that position, and it was a struggle, admittedly, for 211. And I think we quickly put the word out and we did quickly get volunteers, other 211s, other United Ways, and AmeriCorps staff who are willing to come and volunteer and help out. We were able to get them very quickly on the phone and in the computer in our database. I think folks forget that. This is not just like answering the phone. You have to be prepared and you need to have access to the database and you need to know how to get them other resources. Certainly some folks in a time of disaster call just to report their damages, but oftentimes it's more complex than that and they need other basic needs and other supports. You know, the goal moving forward, we've had our internal hot wash already within our agency, and the goal moving forward is to take the time and hopefully be able to support some volunteers or even a position that could help us maintain a list of volunteers that could be prepared for the next emergency. One of the struggles is keeping that amount of volunteers engaged throughout the year or years before anything happens, which is why we work with entities like Volunteers Active in Disaster or Serve Vermont or other agencies like that. You know, it was tough. It was tough to be in that position and to financially be a bit tied to what we had.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And I had another question, but I forgot. So I'm going to go to one of my colleagues, Senator Vyhovsky.
I appreciate your quick mobilization and sort of a sense, you know, as I had said previously, I remember touring 211 many years ago when I was working on developing a statewide support call center, and it's small but mighty operation. And so my question around sort of mobilizing volunteers is, are they trained and prepared to respond to the level of disaster that we're experiencing? That strikes me as a kind of specialized skill set.
Yeah, you know, and I think that we were able to tap into 211s and United Ways who are prepared. I think when we look outside of that, you know, some of the criticism was, why don't you just have a bank of volunteers ready to go? This is why, because you have to have them ready in a time of emergency and disaster. And that's what 211s across the country do. So I think that was not only a quick way to get folks up and running, but a way to get trained folks up and running.
Thank you.
I remembered my question, which is, were you involved in any Vermont Emergency Management after action reviews?
Yes. So we received the survey, and I know that there is a meeting coming up to discuss it.
Mm.
Yep, some of the
Okay,
responses.
so it hasn't happened yet, but you will be involved.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, Senator Watson.
Thank you. So forgive the ignorant nature of this question, but so 211 is a part of state government, or is it like parallel? Is it, I mean, I know you're with the United Way of Vermont. Is it associated with that? Like, so forgive my question here, but what is the structure?
It's a good question, and I appreciate the question because I think a lot of people don't understand it. So I'm always happy to say what's going on there. So the United Ways of Vermont is a unique United Way in that it's the home for statewide programs like Vermont 211 and Help Me Grow Vermont. We're a nonprofit, and while we contract with the state of Vermont, we are not part of state government or a state agency.
Thank you. And then just thinking historically, so you all were active in mobilizing volunteers during Irene, is that right?
It predates me. It's
okay.
Yeah, that predates me.
Okay. One of the things that so with the data that you all are collecting now, are there any guardrails around who you share the data with, or like redactions, or is it like how does somebody tap into that data?
So initially, the way that was happening is at the very start of the flood in July, and we were doing what we had previously done, which is we collect the information and then we would send a report to emergency management and to AHS emergency management. And this time around, while that's what we started doing, there was a real sense of urgency and a real sense of we really want this information as quickly as possible. So they began to pull the data off of, they're called stack forms. That's where the reports were coming in from. So they were able to pull that data if it came through our website on a stack form immediately without us touching it. And that's what they really wanted to do. And so they were able to do that. And then we were still sending them reports from callers versus people completing online. So if somebody didn't have internet access or were older and didn't have, the knowledge base to use the online form or whatever might have been going on there.
So the they in that
emergency management.
That's Vermont Emergency Management. And so, and I felt like I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I felt like I heard a couple like conflicting things, so I just want to make sure that I'm like clear. So you all do not share that information with municipalities, but somebody else does, like VEM maybe was sharing that information with municipalities. Okay, so it was like going through a couple of steps. And it seems like, I mean, do you think municipalities knew that they could pull that information from you all, or was that maybe you don't know if VEM was like automatically sending that information out, like pushing it out to the relevant municipalities? Because I think they would want to know, especially, in their volunteer efforts.
I would say that I don't know specifically and exactly in every case how that was happening, but what I can tell you is they were receiving this encrypted email that had the information for their area. And I only really know this because I would occasionally get calls from somebody in that municipality, and they would say, I can't open the email from you. It's an encrypted email with data, which was, I then had to send them back to the state communications office for that.
It's this is not really a question, but it seems like there is I'm not sure if this is an opportunity or if it already exists, but it seems like there's an opportunity for streamlining the flow of data to help, get help to the people who need it more quickly. And it sounds like you all sort of shifted to make that happen, but it seems like further improvement is possible. Is that a fair statement?
I completely agree.
Okay.
I think there were some great changes made this time around to try to streamline that and make it happen faster. And I think it was just the first step. I think we can build off of that. I think there's more steps to take, but I think it's the right direction.
And I mean, do you think it seems like it feels like that's a rich enough or a complicated enough situation that, like, I don't want to be like building that on the fly necessarily with us unless there are obvious steps. I'm just thinking, like, how do we help streamline that
now when there's not an imminent disaster?
Right, I was gonna say,
So-
now is a good time.
I mean, it seems like we have to do two things. One is streamline the access to data so that the people who really need it have it, while also at the same time having standards for data privacy and sharing of the data. Because I think we all probably heard stories, or I know I did, from people who got calls from organizations who had somehow gotten access to the data and were then offering their help, but oftentimes that help came with weird strings and inappropriate strings. And so I don't know I don't know where those organizations got the data. It sounds like they did not get it from you. So I'm not sure where they got it, if they got it from Vermont Emergency Management or from municipalities
Or their own operation.
FEMA, or I don't know where they got it, but what, do you have any insights?
I also heard stories and had some folks approach me, like Commissioner Winters asked me, how would this potentially have happened if somebody had someone in their home who there was particular call outs for folks who were evangelizing when they were there to muck out a basement, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
This is what may have happened because Crisis Cleanup was the entity that we were using. I don't know how Crisis Cleanup vets, or if they even vet volunteers, or if you just register with them and say, we're a group, we want to register to volunteer. And this could be a broad spectrum from community, civic organizations to religious organizations to loosely knit groups of folks who just want to come together. I'm not really sure. But when somebody called us, and one of the questions we would ask is, do you want assistance with cleanup? If they said yes, we were directed to give them the phone number for Crisis Cleanup to sign up for a volunteer to come help. If they did not call us and this information was collected through the website on the damage reports, that damage report information was shared with emergency management. I do not know if it was then forwarded to Crisis Cleanup or not specifically, but it wouldn't surprise me if perhaps that was part of that streamlining. How quickly can we get help to folks? Let's give it to Crisis Cleanup.
Okay, and Crisis Cleanup is a sort of outside contract organization that manages volunteers. Is that?
Yeah, specifically in disaster. They specifically, they're based out of state and they serve all of the United States, so.
Okay.
And it's called Crisis Cleanup?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we can, do you happen to know the contact for that? Or we can get that from Vermont Emergency Management?
Eric has that.
We can get it from
Eric has it.
All right, can we add that to our list, Olivia? Okay, great. This is really, really helpful, Elizabeth. Are there any other questions at the moment? Senator Clarkson?
So total number of calls you got over the July period, do you have totals on all that? I mean, we have access, but what are and how could we see all that? Could you send that to us?
I can, yes, I can send you our monthly report. In July, we had over 6,000 calls because of the flooding.
Oh, I thought you just said, so the calls equal the damage reports? Because I would
No.
assume there'd be more calls than damage reports.
Yes, we did. We had just shy of 6,000 damage reports. We had over 6,000 calls. So I can send you our monthly report, though. I would be happy to send that should it go to Olivia?
Yeah, if you can send anything to Olivia, and if you have,
Yeah,
if you're able to put any of this testimony in writing, we took notes, but it's always helpful to have the testimony in writing to share on our website.
it would be great. And how many volunteers staffed the calling?
We had over 20 once we got everyone up and running. So we had, I believe it was 7 AmeriCorps. We had several from Denver 211, and then the bulk of our volunteers came from Granite United Way and New Hampshire 211.
Okay, and how many paid staff do you have at 211?
Currently at 211, we have, I have to subtract, help me grow. We currently have 17 at 211. That includes not just folks who are answering the call, but also the resource department. They're the ones in charge of ensuring that information, particularly in times of disaster, is activated in the database. So every shelter, every food shelf, anyone who's doing any kind of programming gets into the database, so that online it's available, as well as for our contact center staff.
Great, okay.
So are you including online responses in your 6,000 calls?
Okay. Not in the calls, but in the damage reports.
Okay. And I guess I just don't know how you get, on any normal night. So we had a very cold night this fall where I had Springfield. We had for a bunch of reasons. They were calling to get people off the street. They were calling you. No one was answering. How do those kind of random last minute events where people say, oh, call 211, how are you staffed for those? And I mean, because I really heard a lot of frustration about some of those kinds of events, sort of not necessarily, I heard less concern over the flooding, but, more concern at points where you, a little more last minute. So, because they needed help with mental health issues, homelessness, trying to get them into housing for the night. I mean, how do you staff those nights, and why would you have people not answering the phone at 211? Where do they go if you're overwhelmed with 17 professionals?
So I think what's key to know is that we are open 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. We're not funded 24 hours. So anyone who's calling us after 11 is not going to get through to a staff person. We're not funded or contracted with Agency of Human Services to operate past 11 p.m. So that's the first piece. When are they calling that they're not getting through?
Yeah, I can't answer that.
Yeah, the second piece is particularly around emergency housing. Since we are administering that program for the state, if all motel rooms are taken and there's no availability, there's not a lot we can do. And so while somebody may call and say, no one helped me, or 211 didn't answer, a lot of times we are answering them and letting them know that there's unfortunately no motel rooms available at that time of night. And while awful, it's the reality. I think we all know that that's true. We have the same staff available every night, because we know that we have to do emergency housing. And then of course we're staffed on the weekends. We use a contracted person on the weekends, a contracted agency, who is staffed with 5 staff folks. So I don't know. I mean, I would be more than happy to take any information about specifics and be able to look into it. All of our calls are recorded. All of the numbers are tracked, hangups and disconnects and all of those things are recorded.
Even after 11 o'clock?
After 11 o'clock, it goes to voicemail, but we can still see when somebody called.
Okay. Right, thanks. I didn't know, that was helpful. And you may have answered this earlier and then maybe I just don't remember. But you're embedded where? Where is 211? 911 is its own thing, but under the umbrella of DPS, right?
She did talk
Yeah,
about
and
this,
I just sort of
Do
missed.
you wanna just
Just quickly, sorry,
Yeah.
you're housed where?
211 is within the United Ways of Vermont.
Oh, that's right, you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, we are gonna, unfortunately have to stop here, but Elizabeth, thank you so much. This is really helpful and,
It's great
if
to meet
anything
you.
comes back up, that you want us to know, please be back in touch and send Olivia any follow-up information.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
No.
Take care. Thanks for everything you and your staff and volunteers
Here,
did during
here.
the flood. I mean, we couldn't have done it without you. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
All right, we're gonna go off live for just a few minutes because I did promise you a break. So we are gonna take just 5 minutes if you need to run down the hall or stretch or anything. So